Hey class, it's Mr. Andrews. So today we're going to talk about synthesizing sources. This idea is actually pivotal to most of what you're going to do throughout college, regardless of what discipline, what field you go into. You're going to be asked in many ways to take ideas and to put them together in meaningful ways. In other words, take perspectives and differing views um, from different scholars and to not just compare, but to actually be able to take elements of their ideas and to apply them to new things, new scenarios. And that's what we mean by synthesizing ultimately. It's the idea of taking multiple sources and multiple ideas and applying them to a singular uh, purpose. Now, here's what we mean by that. What is synthesis is a great way to start this. And one way that we might define synthesis is by examining where the term, at least as far as it's used in academia, comes from. Now, the term comes from a philosopher named Hegel. And Hegel had this idea of what he called the dialectic. The dialectic was, he said, a pattern that human thought and human history really falls into. He saw history, he was a very optimistic person as a philosopher who saw human history as constantly developing and improving on itself. In other words, he made the argument that human history learns from itself. He saw human history as an ongoing conversation that continues to learn from itself, where an idea, a trend, would come up and arise in human society, would be met with an opposing point of view, and then ultimately would lead to some sort of advancement. Now, he called these three steps the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. So, what does that mean? A thesis, he would say, is one point of view that represents something. So, for example, in terms of governing people, right, we might consider a thesis to be kings, just the idea of a monarchy, of an individual who runs the government, who is the government, who is over everything, and who has absolute power. That's a thesis, right? Because not only is it a way of governing people, but it represents an idea that a particular person or bloodline is not only entitled to run society, but that society even functions best when it's run by a singular person. That, in a sense, is an argument, right? It's a position, it's an idea. He says, on the other hand, though, we might consider an antithesis too, because whenever there's a thesis, he argues, in human history, there's going to be an antithesis. There's going to eventually arise an opposing point of view. Now, and a good antithesis to this would be the idea of democracy, right? Which is in and of itself almost an exact opposite of monarchy. It is something that where everybody has equal playing field, at least in an ideal democracy, right? Everybody would be voting on every single function and facet of society. Um, and so we have a thesis and we have an antithesis. Well, where's the synthesis coming, right? Because in many ways, Hegel would argue that throughout human history, perhaps humans noted that there were some things that were positive about both of these opposing points of view. For instance, everybody, I think, can respect the idea that it's good to be in a democracy where you're free, where you have a choice, where people are able to choose and have some determination in how society goes and runs, right? But on the other hand, there's also an argument to be made, believe it or not, for monarchy as well, right? Consider for a moment the mob rule during the French Revolution, right? Democracy isn't always pretty either. In fact, sometimes if you have a good king, a person who believes in the good of the whole, or who believes in justice and is actually a good and noble person at the top, you can actually have a very well run and functioning society if you have a person who is well intentioned who's running things. And in fact, they could run things very efficiently in a way that maybe a full on democracy couldn't. And so there's an argument to be made from both sides. But what a synthesis does is it brings these together. And some would even argue, Hegel might argue, that the republic that we have today in the United States is a synthesis of these two ideas. Yes, we have a democracy, people vote and people represent themselves. But on the other hand, we also, in a sense, do have kings, or at least we have people who are appointed to represent us, people who run the government. We have people like presidents and congresspeople and judges who do observe higher positions of power. But there's this element of democracy involved as well. The republic, in other words, Hegel would argue, is a synthesis, a bringing together of ideas from this thesis and this antithesis. So, what does that mean for us? Like, a good way of thinking about synthesis is that it is something we do from the very beginnings of our existence, right? For example, let's look at little Timmy here, right? Timmy is told that the stove is dangerous. That's a thesis. It's an idea. When we were all kids, we were told that something was dangerous to us, right? But we've all been there where the antithesis arose in us. We decided, hey, I know I was told this thing was dangerous, but this stove looks really fun and I am going to touch it for sure. That is an antithesis, right? Because on the one hand, you're told it's dangerous, but if it looks fun, I mean, come on, surely looks can't be deceiving. Aha, there's the synthesis, right? Because when we touch the stove, we know that the synthesis is going to arrive that we were told it was dangerous. It turns out to be true, but we also know it looked really fun. What's the synthesis there? The synthesis is that looks can be deceiving, right? What's the ultimate product of those two things when we combine those ideas? So, how do we begin to practice synthesis in a paper, right? It begins by first finding our focus. We need to have a conversation in order to have any synthesis. So, what is the conversation going to be about? As you know, you've been developing a question about Mean Girls. And so, what I want you to do right after I finish reading off the slide is I really want you to take a moment to look over your notes for Mean Girls, look back at your double journal, and I want you to look especially at the questions that you developed in the right-hand column. But what I'd like you to do is pick out maybe one, maybe two of those questions that you really like, and I'd like you to draft out 3 possible versions of that question. Try to get more specific and much more focused with every single rewrite, okay? Just take a few minutes and see if you can't revise and eventually land on what you think is going to be the one question that you can really focus on, that can really give your paper work to do. It should, again, be a question without an obvious answer. So take a moment, draft that out, and meet me back here on this video. Okay, so maybe you've already done that, and maybe you have a question now that you're going to make this entire paper, this entire conversation about. Well, once you have that question, right, now what we really need to do after defining the conversation is you need to know where each source is going to help answer the question. You need to figure out, in other words, what role the article by Fromm is going to play and what role the article by Ross and Nisbet is going to play. So you might think of your sources as almost being like a team that are working towards the same goal in this paper, right? Obviously, not all of their ideas are going to take equal part in this. One may play a more major and minor role in this, right? And so one source may prove to be more helpful or direct, but it could be that the ideas from the other source may still be involved in some significant way. And so what we're going to do for that, I'm skipping ahead here in the slideshow because the rest of this we'll be looking at a different day, is we're going to create what is called a synthesis matrix. Now, a synthesis matrix is just kind of a chart that allows you to visually see what sources are going to play a role in what parts of your paper. So you might think of this as almost being like an outline / source organizer, okay? But the idea here is to get a sense of how this synthesis is going to play out. So what you're going to do when you get down to the link just below this video, you're going to see a sheet that involves a thesis workshop and synthesis matrix. You're going to start with this part here. Now, this is an example. If I were writing a paper on World War II and how it affected female gender roles and expectations, that I might start with the research question itself. So what I want you to do is at the top of your matrix, I would like you to write out what was the question you ultimately developed about Mean Girls you're going to focus on in your paper, okay? Once you have that, what you're next going to do is on this left-hand column, I want you to go through and I want you to think through some sub-questions. Now, we did something like this with our first paper, thinking through what are some smaller questions that I could answer along the way as I answer this larger question. So looking at your Mean Girls question, what are some sub-questions, some smaller questions that you could maybe tackle within your paper? These questions might be the who's, the what's, the when, the where's, the why's, and the how's. So consider those beginnings, right? Because those are the kinds of questions you really want to focus on so that you can give yourself sort of a very focused breakdown of the problem. So once you've written those questions into this left side, and you'll see on your synthesis matrix, there are 6 boxes. You don't have to use all 6, but I would advise using at least 3 or 4 of them. Um, Developing those questions, what are you going to do next? Well, once you have those questions in place, in these rows here and these other columns you see over to the side, you are going to include a column for each of your sources. Now, there's already a column built into yours, one for Fromm, one for Ross and Nesbitt. And what you're going to do is similar to what they've done here is you're going to try to list out any details, complete with page numbers, from each of the sources that you think helps to address the question that you're looking at in that row. So for example, in this one, how did women's roles change because of World War II? Well, as you can see, they've got 4 different sources and they've got the authors' names all along the top here. Each source has something to say, and so they've included it. Some have a little more to say than others, as you can see, right? But if we look at the second question here, we can see that all the way on the right, this source that is labeled Scott, that source has absolutely nothing to say on that question. And this is where we start to realize what the major and minor roles of your sources may be, because on some of your questions, it could be that Fromm will have a lot to say, but maybe Ross and Nisbet have nothing to say. And likewise, maybe you'll have another question where it's the opposite, or where they both have something to say, right? And it's going to be a question of comparing their ideas or even discriminating between their ideas. So this is what you're going to do is visually map out where each source has something to say about your topic through this. Once you've completed that synthesis matrix, then what you're going to do is then get into the thesis workshop, where I'm asking you to take a series of steps to ultimately devise what is a synthesized or combined viewpoint using ideas from both of them. Now, this doesn't mean you have to perfectly use, ideas equally from Fromm and Ross and Nisbet. No, no, no. But what you are doing is ultimately you should use ideas from both of them to develop an answer for the question. And that's what we mean by synthesis. So take a look just below here, click on the synthesis matrix / thesis workshop. It will create a copy of a document for you. That is what you are going to plan on completing for next class. Now, you will want to make sure that you bring this with you to class or share it with me by next class if you are in group number 2, because group number 2 is going to be meeting with me in person, and we're going to do some in-person conferencing during that class time. Now, if you're in group number 1, you are going to be working on a drafting workshop next time. Likewise, though, you will want to also have this complete, because this is really a rough outline for the paper that you're going to begin using as you begin drafting next class. So that said, that is it for today. That is the lesson on synthesis. I wish you the best of luck as you're getting started, but do reach out to me if you have questions today about what you're doing, and I wish you the best. See you soon.